Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Like Ella said, my name is Anita Badajo. I work at The Times. I'm a supervising editor at The Daily, which is the New York Times' daily news podcast. And I'm very excited to be here moderating this panel on what the climate movement can learn from other social movements, which is a very important discussion to have at this moment. So I'm joined here today in person by Farhana Yaman, who is, of course, an internationally renowned environmental lawyer, activist, and author. So thank you so much for being here, Farhana. And I am joined virtually on screen by Elizabeth Wathuti, who is a climate activist from Kenya and the founder of the Green Generation Initiative. And I am also joined by Fabrice Oudard, who is an LGBTQ activist based in New York, as well as a corporate advisor and a former officer at the UN and the World Bank. So a pretty incredible panel here today. So I just wanted to start off by acknowledging that, we're living in a moment where there are so many different urgent, intersecting, overlapping social movements. Of course, you have movements for women's rights, and at this moment, particularly reproductive rights. You have movements for the lives of queer people and trans people, particularly athletes and youth. We have movements for Black lives, Asian lives, Indigenous lives. We have movements to combat police brutality and gun violence, and so many more that I obviously cannot include in this session, because if I go on, I will risk offending someone because I left them out. So I think I just wanted to start off by acknowledging that and asking you all, what do you see as sort of the similarities between the climate movement and these other movements that we are all contending with in this moment? And what do you see as some of the key differences? And I think, Farhana, we'll start with you.
Oh, thank you, and thanks for having me. I guess in a nutshell, I feel most of these movements, the labour movement, the women's movement, the anti-racism movement, the movement for gender diversity, and the movement for sexual orientation as a difference to be recognised. So many others, as you said, ableism, the disabled movement. What have they got in common now, and what are they seeing? I think they're seeing that the economic system that we've had in place for the last 400 years is the common system that does not value diversity, and that does not value nature, that does not value, literally, because it's based on the primacy of capitalism. That is the DNA of this system. And so you were less valued if you weren't in the body of, at that time when the DNA was settled, a white, abled man were able to work in the economy. You may have been valued as a labourer, but you would have been disvalued if you weren't able to fully do labour, and you were valued primarily if you held land or capital. So I think there is a massive theoretical as well as actual understanding going on that the system is needs dismantling and needs replacing, and these demands to have the value and the worth of every single body acknowledged and accepted, no matter what that body looks like and no matter what its capabilities, and that's what's uniting them. And increasingly they're all pointing in the same direction, which is for a human rights-based approach, for a nature-based approach, for an approach that does not give primacy to profits and extractivism, and which allows us to be at peace in an inner sense as well. So it's a very long-winded answer, but at least that's my answer, and that's what I feel I've come to. From my very first protest, age 14, was Rock Against Racism, and then I went on to join many of the women's groups. When I got to university, I went to an all-female university at the time, at college at the time. And I worked alongside the peace movement, which also I think couldn't be a more germane movement to learn from right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm hearing maybe is the takeaway from what you just said is that what all these movements have in common is that they're realizing that capitalism isn't necessarily working for us.
No, and we can just call it business as usual is not working for us.
Sure.
Sometimes if you put an ism on, I feel like that's another learning that they've all learnt the minute you identify that. people go, oh, but we don't want to be communist or socialist or some other ism. But actually, everyone, if you say the current system isn't working, pretty much everyone agrees.
Mm.
Everyone agrees. But identifying where we go forward is really about strategy and tactics.
Right.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, I'm wondering how you would answer that question.
I would say that injustice anywhere is definitely injustice everywhere. And one of the things that we've noticed with most of the movements is the fact that most of these inequalities have been greatly caused by unequal power dynamics. And a good example in the climate movement, when we say that women are the most impacted by the climate crisis, this is true that they are definitely in many times seen as vulnerable, and especially because if you look at the global south, it is women who have to walk for long distances to look for food and water for their families, but also it's these same women that are solution providers that are every day working on solutions to be able to deal with some of these impacts. And so I see that some of these movements, the way in which we should be we ought to be in solidarity with one another and recognize that it's because of inequalities that we are facing most of the challenges that the world is facing today. And so we cannot afford to exclude really key and important voices in every movement, because if we continue to exclude key and important voices, then we still continue in the same way of rising inequalities all around the world. And these are global problems that also require global solutions and require global solidarity as well.
Absolutely. And Fabrice, you have done for years and years work in the LGBTQIA plus movement, and so I'm curious sort of what the similarities and differences you see there to the climate movement.
Yes, thank you. Well, as you mentioned, I'm kind of a one-trick pony. I always work on LGBTQ issues. But one thing that strikes me is that there is an urgency, right? There is a huge urgency to social change on LGBTQ plus issues globally, because the gap between the most tolerant areas and the least tolerant areas is not sustainable in a connected world. And then similarly, there is an urgency for social change on climate change, very obviously. But then another similarity that strikes me is political manipulation. LGBTQ issues are being manipulated by opportunistic politicians, as are climate change issues. And then the last point I would make is that I feel that truth is not enough anymore, which is kind of sad, but in a way, even though it is obvious, the reality is obvious, it's not enough, right? And we have to campaign and we have to be strategic in gaining support for those issues, despite the fact that the reality is not negotiable, right? It's obvious to us that the world is facing a crisis on climate change and that the world is facing a crisis on the way it deals with minorities. But unfortunately, that's not enough. We have to campaign.
Right. Elizabeth, I was curious to ask you, many of the most recognized social movements, so sort of most easily identifiable social movements, are tied to issues of identity, race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. And I think what can be difficult for people is that the climate movement can often be framed in much more existential terms, right? It's about the entire planet. And so I'm curious sort of what you have found to be sort of the best ways to bring it down to a more individual level.
Yeah, climate change is definitely a global problem, but what we see in terms of how climate change is addressed, we see certain key voices that are being excluded from the movement, and key voices whose voices really matter. And every time we talk about frontline communities, for example, being impacted by the climate crisis at a huge level, and most of them are impacted disproportionately. But when it comes to the global community and whose voices are being heard and whose voices are being centered in decision making, most of these voices are missing. And that is why, as much as this is a global problem, we cannot forget that it's also a social justice issue, and it's also a racial justice issue, because some of these key voices are still being excluded. We cannot solve the climate crisis without key voices, without frontline communities, without voices that have for often been excluded from the movement and also excluded from key decision making. And talking about climate change, this is about people. It's about putting people at the center and at the heart of making decisions. But it is these same people who are facing the crisis and the impacts today that are not often represented in these spaces. So we have to make sure that everybody has got an equal representation, that the key voices, frontline communities, people that have for often not been heard for a long time are also at the table, because then we're not going to solve this crisis without every voice and every story and every person who is being impacted at the center of it all.
Yeah, I want to stay on that for a moment because as you're acknowledging in what you just said, you know, the face of the climate movement is often white, male, able-bodied, Western. I know that Farhana, that's something that you sort of saw very intimately when you were working with Extinction Rebellion, and I'm just sort of curious how you think the climate movement can go about, you know, being more inclusive, more diverse, and just building a broader coalition.
Yeah, sure. Yesterday I had a seminar, 200 people attended, on decolonizing philanthropy. And one of the reasons why we're doing that is the resources which are necessary for social movements. You know, they often bubble up, as the youth movement did. A huge amount of voluntary resources are built in. But in philanthropy, 80% of the climate funding that is going to organizations led by men. Still, this is still the case. So yeah, get over that. And 90% of it is going to organizations led by white people, when the people on the front line and the people who actually, whose lives need to change and who are in a position to make decisions are primarily brown and black and based outside of Europe and North America. So that's one of the reasons why I'm doing that project, partly as a result of the massive way in which we need to include and diversify in the most radical way possible those who are actually at the forefront of injustice and those who are at the forefront of new solutions that were excluded, diminished, not heard, solutions where seen as too radical and politically unacceptable. So that's, I think, you know, ties in many of the threads that we're discussing. And you know, at Glasgow, 40,000 participants, the largest delegation actually that was worked out by Carbon Brief was the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry was the largest delegation of fossil fuel lobbyists. They spread themselves out everywhere. And the second largest, which I'm very proud of, was the indigenous people, actually. And that one was heard more and is, you know, at the table. So I think to complement and maybe, yes, we need people who are excluded at the table, but we need to take away some of the power of people who shouldn't be at the table in the first place at this point in time. That's what needs to happen. Many of these industries, coal is not profitable without taxpayers' money, which is subsidizing it, and without all of the externalities, as economists call them, you know, not being taken into account. So that's the only way in which these industries are now viable, and they know that, and that's why they spend huge amounts of their budgets on lobbying, marketing, outright, you know, campaign contributions, left, right, and center, and maintaining their grip on political power and maintaining their grip on public purse. On the public purse, it's our money that is going to subsidizing still, you know, the biggest polluting industries in the world. So I'm sorry if I sound very passionate about this, but this is, as I said, one of the main reasons why, you know, a few years ago I just decided that, you know, it's not worth it for me to raise budgets for another report or do what I was doing. You know, when the top 5 emitters had invested $1 billion since the Paris Agreement. This is a report that came out in 2019. So in just 3 years, $1 billion in narrative change, lobbying, marketing, and advertising, greenwashing. We can't compete against that. And so that reality needs to also come forward now, and there needs to be a story about it, not just once a month, every single day. You know, it should be, you know, in the New York Times, it should be a ticker saying, do you know that your dollars are going here? Do you know that your pounds are still going here? Every single day, so that this reality is systematically heard, understood, and acted on, because it's still hidden. It's still too small a number of people who are trying to expose that imbalance, that structural, political, financial imbalance.
Right. So it sounds like what you're saying, it's not just about expanding and including more people, but at this point it needs to be about excluding some as well.
Yeah, and we did that. Over time, the tobacco industry, for example, was not allowed to be at the same negotiating table in the health sector. You have very clear guidelines and rules and regulations that now, where health decisions are made about the choice of drugs or what to buy, then the industry is regulated. It's not allowed to be at the top table because there's a fantastic conflict of interest, and we haven't had that. We've carried on with this mindset of engagement, of dialogue, of having a nice conversation, of thinking they'll do the right thing. And I don't think that's the case. I'm not willing to have another 10 years worth of dialogues in the off chance that they might change their mind and say, oh, yes, you're right, we should really be winding down. Yeah.
Fabrice, I wanted to go to you because, earlier when we were talking, you sort of mentioned some specific mistakes you actually felt that the LGBTQ movement had made when it comes to inclusion. And so I'm wondering sort of what lessons can be learned from those mistakes and applied to the climate movement.
I love that question. I have to say that, it has become very clear to us that the mistake we did is that the movement was led by the elite white gay men who felt that marriage equality would benefit them. And so all the focus was on marriage equality, which did happen, but eventually it did not benefit the most marginalized in our community, queer people, people of color, trans people. And now one of the things that is coming out is that the white gay men that have created a place under the sun for themselves are saying, well, the fight is over. I have gotten what I wanted. I'm getting out. And in fact, some of them are feeling that trans issues is undermining their newly found respectability, and they are trying to desolidarize themselves from the rest of the community. And similarly, we have had people write in op-ed that the gay rights movement has achieved its goal, when still the vast majority of LGBTQ plus people are living in places where their lives are criminalized and where they have no chance at economic opportunity or dignity. And so we made a mistake, which is that by letting elite capture happen, we are now realizing that the most privileged have basically benefited from the LGBTQ plus movement and now are stepping out. The second aspect, I love what Farhana just said about the mistake of engaging the private sector, and engaging companies that maybe are not genuine and authentic in their desire to change the status quo. One of the things that really strikes me is that if you look at one of our main organizations, GLAAD, the biggest donor is Gilead. And Gilead is a company that is giving money to anti-LGBTQ plus politicians, but is also, frankly, in the middle of a lawsuit where allegedly they were gouging the prices of HIV medication for our community to the point of leading gay men to ruin. And so there is that weird thing in which, in a way, they have managed to insert themselves in the movement that is trying to fight exactly what they have been creating. And so, that's probably a cautionary tale for the climate change movement, which is if beneficiaries are not at the table, if there is not governance and oversight mechanisms, there is a huge risk of co-optation of the movement, which will lead to negative outcomes.
Yeah, please go ahead. I want to stay with you for a moment because you did sort of just mention maybe at times the sort of inauthentic intentions or goals of corporations, and you yourself have worked with corporations quite a bit, and I'm curious, there is a sense at times when social movements become big enough that they finally, the corporate sector really has to confront and engage with them, that there's a sense that they might either pay lip service to them or at worst at times co-opt them. And I'm just curious sort of in your work how you have found to engage with those issues and also to really assure that someone is being genuine and really is going to frankly put their money where their mouth is.
What I think is crucial, first of all, is that as individuals, we constantly realize that we might have more chance in influencing the world as consumers, employees, and investors than as democratic, part of the democratic process. Because in fact, we are realizing that our wallet is talking more, and our talent is talking more than our democratic power. And so it's important that we constantly use that power to target the world we want to achieve. And what we have done in the movement is that sometimes we have twisted the arm of companies to do what we wanted them to do, which is we have applied pressure. One of the mistakes that we have done is that we have not created independent watchdogs, which could help us differentiate between the good guys and the bad guys. And what I love about what Farhana said earlier is that companies are spending gigantic amount of money trying to make their track record murky. You know what I mean? They will spend huge amount of money on communication, on public relations, without really doing the work. And so we need independent watchdogs, which are going to look in depth. Are they giving money to anti-LGBTQ politicians? Are they taking real steps to contribute to cut their carbon emissions? Or are they just doing the PR aspect? And then the thing that I will tell you is that in the LGBTQ plus movement, what is terrible is that at some point, our organizations were basically the interface between beneficiaries and institutions, like governments and companies. Now it's the contrary. Government and companies are so overrepresented in our boards, including non-profit boards, that they are using the institution to send a message to the beneficiaries. And it's kind of a reversal of what we created at the beginning when we set up those institutions. And we have to come back to a system in which those organizations are at the service of beneficiaries and not at the service of government and corporations.
Farhana, I just see you're shaking your head. Did you want to add to that?
There's so much richness in the learnings. And I think I was sort of nodding because, everyone is this diversity, equity or equality inclusion agenda. It's kind of become like a slight tick box agenda without, looking at what are the real systematic removal of barriers, which is much, much sort of deeper and much more honest. So it's much easier to now, I get asked, I'm sure this happened, to join boards and to be on them. And actually, in effect, you're not really looking at what is really happening to those on the front lines, what is really happening to those disadvantaged communities. Is it an extra burden, frankly, participating sometimes in these spaces when they haven't yet recognized they need to go beyond that? They need to go beyond the tick boxing and the appointment of someone. Does that person really have the power to change the frame, to change the operating, the underlying operating systems? Can they fund things in a different way, in a different geography, or fund, for example, in the case of philanthropy, something else altogether? And I think most of the time the answer is no. So there's a lot of, tick boxing that happens, a lot of servicing of others, and it's sort of exhausting at times. So I was sort of partly nodding because yesterday here, thank you also to the Conduit in the New York Times, we had a film, Can I Live, by a black activist and an actor called Fenty Balogun. And most of the audience was actually black and brown people who came, and we had drinks. And sometimes it was just quite comforting being together and having our only spaces, us only spaces, where we can navigate and support each other. As I said, there's also a huge backlash that is come as a result of the progress we have made. And I always frame it in that way. The backlash is huge and very visible, but it's come as a result of a massive amount of progress that we've made in the acknowledgement of our human rights. And sometimes that pressure is quite daunting, and that's what's happening, not just in the US with your Supreme Court decisions, but also here in this country with, you know, this normalization of a very brutal system, which is saying basically if you've arrived in some legal way in this country, you're okay, but if you're black and brown, you invite you know, you're fleeing conflict or you're a refugee or you know, you are not welcome. You will be shipped off to another country. You will be treated in the harshest way possible. You will be left to die, frankly. So I feel like the other things that are going on is not just the climate movement recognizing that their struggle is linked with racial justice, with gender justice, but also migrants' justice. We must have a really big look at the way in which borders, you know, came to be, the nation state came to be, the imperial order came to be. There is an imperial order. There is a part of the world that is now being kept safe and a huge swathe of the world that is being sacrificed. That is a sacrifice zone, and people are fleeing from the sacrifice zone, and those people are being left to drown, to die, or being incarcerated as illegal migrants, illegal refugees. That is what the labels themselves speak volumes for the kind of brutal world that we're creating. So very much now, I think in the forefront of the social movements and their learnings is this desire and this appetite to as I said, rip apart the legal conceptual apparatus that went hand in hand with this very brutal order that did not in any way ever set out to you know, create a society based on the well-being of all. It never did. I mean, where was that in the DNA of capitalism? It wasn't there. So trying to sort of graft that on is what we're trying to do. But increasingly I feel actually let's dismantle and recognize the degree to which we need to dismantle, and globally we will only flourish if we can actually make sure that the well-being and the prosperity is available to everyone and not just a few. And by a few I mean, you know, Europe and the US, basically. Europe, the US and Australia, and you know, and they are exporting now human beings, you know, that are the problematic human beings for them. So sorry if I sound very harsh, but I think sometimes the reality that I work with, I have 4 children who are very active, so if they don't see me hearing any of these things publicly, they'll say, Mum, you know, you're just one of those neoliberal climate policy persons that are so out of touch with the world. So thank you, kids. We'll see you later. But they are at the forefront, and I feel our young people have somehow magically integrated what we sort of in a nerdy way call this intersectional approach, which is looking at different sources of injustice and weaving together a really magical way of kind of, you know, making a much better world than we've done. Yeah, and working with very different values as well of how they organize themselves as movements.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Farhana, because you perfectly set up my transition for me, which is Elizabeth. I did want to go to you because, of course, you know, much of your work is based in Kenya, and as we know, the people who are going to bear the brunt of climate change and who are already bearing the brunt of it are those in the developing world. And I think there can often be a tension where, you know, for someone in Kenya who might not even know where their next meal is coming from, climate change in that moment might be the last thing on their minds, even though, you know, the food scarcity is directly tied to climate change. And then in fact, the way they may be able to earn the money to provide their next meal is to work in the very industry that's extracting resources that then is contributing even more to climate change. And so it can feel like a real conundrum, to say the least. And I'm just curious sort of how you've gone about of doing your work and sort of addressing the needs of communities on the ground in Kenya and what we can learn from that.
Yeah, I've spent the past few weeks away from home talking about the humanitarian crisis back at home, and especially across the Horn of Africa, where we have over 20 million people that are facing climate-related starvation. And what struck me most is that most of these people in these communities do not know that they're carrying a burden that they're least responsible for, but yet every day they're the ones that have to really figure it out by themselves. And we've also seen in many countries across Africa that have had to even be on more debts to just deal with the climate crisis impacts. And it's definitely an injustice. And I think one of the things that I would add in terms of inclusion is that the global community needs to actually redefine what inclusion means, because inclusion is supposed to be meaningful. It's supposed supposed to be genuine in a way that we do not just put people or certain people in there to just tick a box, but everybody is supposed to be involved in the entire process. Because if this is about decision making, we're making decisions for people and on behalf of people who are possibly not on the table where these decisions are being made. And for most of these communities, they really should be the ones that their stories are being amplified, that their stories are being told to the world, because we are living at times when we have so much science and so much information. We do not lack any of that. But for me, I strongly believe that these are human problems. We have failed to take urgent action. And what we see, even in summits where climate negotiations are taking place, we see a pattern of pledges that are being made and they're never met. We also see a pattern of a lot of self-interest and a pattern where there's so much disconnect with what is happening on the ground in reality, that we are so much stuck in a space where we actually forget that we are talking about people whose lives and livelihoods depends on the decisions that we make today. And many times as we continue to delay these actions, it's these same people that we continue to lose their lives, to lose their livelihoods. And for me, I see this as a problem of how are we giving solidarity and giving back hope to communities who direly need that hope right now, who are losing hope for their future, and they're desperate about a future that's not even guaranteed for them. And this is also about building trust, because we have a pattern right now where we've lost trust, especially in the system that has continued to put more impacts and more pressure on people that have least caused the climate crisis. And I think for me, this is where we should turn around and actually focus on international solidarity and cooperation. And also this is about accountability, that we have so many of these solutions on climate change, but they are somewhere in terms of pledges and commitments that have not been met for so many years. And this is costly. It's costly to humanity. It's costly to these communities on the front line, but still they are not represented. They're still not being heard. And in many times they are put in spaces, but their voices are still not being heard enough, because if they were being heard, I think the humanitarian crisis right now, as described, could not and should not be worsening, and at least there should be help coming to some of these communities. But we see also some of these voices really not being amplified, and also we see a lot of blockages of key important issues that could support frontline communities who are dealing with the impacts right now.
Thank you so much. So I just wanted to make sure to leave some time for your questions. So I think we can transition now to audience Q&A. And I believe we'll be taking 3 questions at a time, and then our panelists can answer 3 at a time. And please, in your question, please just mention if it is for a specific panelist or for the entire panel.
Hi, I'm Utkarsh. Thank you for this discussion, and it's very inspiring. But so I come from a mining and sustainability background, and it's a sector which has a rich history of social movements. And one of the key achievements of this movement has been codifying some of these movement goals and objectives in the form of a concept called social license to operate, which gives back the power to indigenous people to reject certain companies or their projects within their areas. Do you think something similar coming up in the key area of climate change as well, something like social license to emit, and how quickly would that be coming in? Because that would be one of the ways to give power back to the community and the peoples whose voice are not being heard, and give them a front place there.
Great. Thank you all so much for that talk. So I'd like to go back to a point you made about if we let people know, that their money is going into funding fossil fuels. But my question is for those people who know but still don't care. So the fact is that there are people working at these fossil fuel lobbies who are then funding this money. And they're the kind of people who... There's a video online of an activist standing outside a clothing store explaining to a woman going in, do you understand the plight of the garment workers in Bangladesh making your clothes? Do you understand the destruction that the fast fashion industry is having? And this woman turns around and goes, I don't care, I just want my clothes really cheaply. And when you also have Republican voters in the States who, when it was explained what Trump policies might do to certain minorities in the States, they were like, I see that, but I think he's going to keep my taxes low. So when you explain to these people both suffering and injustice, that you're met with indifference and self-interest, I guess my question is twofold here. How have we ended up in this, I guess, moral vacuum? And in any of your experiences, have you, as someone really interested in behaviour change, have you developed any tools to move these people when empathy and caring and all the things that I think everyone in this room responds to, when they do not respond to that, what are you using to move them?
Great. Was there a third question, or should we start with those two? Okay, we'll start with those two. There is a lot to get through there. So yeah, I'm wondering if we can start with the first one about social license, and I don't know if who would like to tackle that one first.
Well, I guess I can,
Please.
as it's about climate change.
Yeah.
But welcome, Elizabeth. You're behind me on the screen. I can't see you, so keep looking around. I think in the last few years, the social license to operate of the fossil fuel industries has been really challenged. For example, the movement to divest is doing a huge amount to educate, sensitize, and make people aware that their money is now directly supporting industries that are committing, in my view, large-scale genocide and knowingly doing that. That is what is the consequence of all the droughts that are threatening the lives of millions of people. And to talk about it in those very simple to understand terms, the industry has been well aware of what was to come and has, sponsored academic institutions, art institutions. They're in they have done that deliberately. They haven't done that, just because they're really nice people. They've done that to buy social license, to buy off and influence and, make you think that they're morally upright corporate citizens of the world. So I think there's a lot of challenges coming. And so, from the arts and culture side, the refusal to accept money, the refusal to perform, the refusal by those organisations to say, please find a different business model that is not dependent on Shell and BP and Exxon funding, an arts or a science exhibition, actually about climate change. Now, how perverse is that? So all of these things are happening, and I think the biggest challenge has come from youth and young people who are really tackling, and sometimes in my case, refusing to participate or be in the COP processes, the UN spaces, which are now basically massive corporate zones, pavilions and side events that cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. Who can afford that? Only the big corporates with real vested interest can do that. So I think the question about how to tackle it, is there some code, is there some conduct, is a really good one. And that's where I feel the energy is coming from, a demand to say, actually, you're not even welcome at the top table, and we need to regulate you, and we need to stop using these voluntary, as I said, voluntary measures, which is basically what we've used for the last sort of 30 years. I don't want to take up all the time that you have, but I personally don't fight against individuals as such, because I think the culture and the moral imperatives that are there, and psychologically, and the amount of consumer, it's nice for me to also buy some nice clothes. So I went on a fashion fast for a couple of years, which was really important. And so we have a huge decolonization and desensitization of the need to purchase to feel better. That has to go on. And fashion is a very good place to start that, because actually everyone can get by. If there was a war tomorrow, you would get by without buying any new clothes for decades, probably. Actually, everyone would mend, sew, repair, and wear whatever they needed. So it is a really important campaigning point, and I'm really happy that you had the sustainable fashion panel yesterday. So I'm going to be quiet now and let the other panelists say, and you to guide us. Thank you.
No, I mean, that was fantastic. Elizabeth, I wondered if you wanted to chime in on either of those questions.
Yeah, I would like to respond to the second question. And this is because I strongly believe that every person that has stepped up to be a voice of change for certain challenges, because they were compelled from deep within themselves to take up that action and to make that change happen. But I feel today, as the world, we are running away from our moral responsibility to make sure that our way of doing things and our actions every day do not negatively impact the planet or negatively impact people in different parts of the world. And so for me, it is about getting compelled to take action, because we have said so many things. We have had leaders being told so many things in different platforms, year in, year out, but still many of them are still not doing what they're supposed to do. So we have to keep asking ourselves, how are we cultivating our moral responsibility as humans to make sure that this is a human problem? And if we have a human problem, to solve it, we need a human heart, we need a human mind to actually come to our inner self and understand that it is our actions today that are impacting our planet, that are impacting the people everywhere around the world. And also recognizing that while climate change is impacting the frontline communities today, sooner or later, these impacts are going to be felt all around the world through supply chains, through migration, through biodiversity breakdown. But we will not be able to be moved to take action unless we also cultivate love and compassion, unless we understand that people are being impacted everywhere. So we have to ensure that we have this at the center and at the heart of every decision that we're making and in every step of the way. And this is also the best way to make sure that we're having real climate action, because today we see big businesses and corporations still driving deforestation, and still we see governments investing massively in fossil fuels. And yet we are hearing stories of how communities on the front line are being impacted. And this in itself is not moral responsibility, where we actually know and we see what is happening, but we are not being moved to take action just because it's possibly not happening where we are. I think for me, and why being an activist, sometimes you have to take in so much of this before you share it out to the world. And I always say that I strongly believe that we have a human capacity to care deeply and to act collectively. But again, it has to come from deep within ourselves. We cannot only depend on duty imposed upon us to take action. We have to cultivate a natural call to action, to see challenges and respond to them, and to be able to identify with challenges and put self-interest aside and remember that not any one country or any one individual can be able to solve this global problem alone. We need collective action. We need every person to step up, but it has to come from deep within ourselves. So we have to keep reminding people and telling these really human and personal stories as well, but also stories of resilience, because most of these communities that we talk about every day, they have also chosen not to be victims. They are working on solutions every day. They're leading local action and initiatives, but it's most often those local action and initiatives that also are not being amplified, that also are not getting the center stage as well. So it is a moral responsibility. That's how I see it. And to solve a human problem, we need a human heart and a human mind. And remember that we have to put people and our planet at the center and at the heart of every decision that we make and every action that we take, whether as individuals, as governments, as corporations, every person, because for us to change everything, we're going to need everyone to take action.
So I think we have just 2 minutes left, so I don't know if Fabrice, you wanted to add anything to all of that.
Well, very quickly, I love the concept of social license to operate. And I'll tell you, I was speaking with the CEO of a Global 500 a few weeks ago, and he said to me, we have to teach our Gen Z employees that we are not here to change the world. And I responded to him and I said, God never came down from the sky to tell us that the goal of our economic system is to maximize shareholder value. That's a concept we build together, and if this is not working for humankind, we can change the concept. And so I completely agree. Corporations have to acquire a social license to operate. And on your second point, which is, I'm a Frenchman, I'm extremely negative, but one of the things that I will tell you is that on LGBTQ plus issues, 50 years ago, we were being given electroshock therapy. And now 75% or 80% of Americans approve same-sex marriage. And they were in the street of New York last weekend cheering the gay pride parade. How did we achieve this gigantic social change? I think, part of it was scientific campaigning. And we have to be very scientific in the way we approach campaigning on climate change, figuring out which messages people are receptive to. And in fact, the messages should sometimes be adapted to communities, because what we have discovered on LGBTQ plus issues is that each community has values that they respond to. And so, one of the big takeaway of the LGBTQ plus movement is that sometimes what feels good to us is not what is going to sway people's behavior and people's opinions, right? And so we have to invest money and resources in trying to figure out what are the messages that are going to appeal to people and change their behavior as well as their hearts and minds.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think with that ends our panel. So I just want to thank all three of you so much for being here and everyone in the room for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.